Hello, podcaster. This episode is so special because I believe, one of the shows that's going to really help you figure out exactly what your podcast purpose is, give you a little bit of guidance and examples on things that you can do so you can feel successful on your show. My name is Anna Xavier, and this is the Podcast Space. Okay, podcaster, let's talk about goals. So, why is it important to have a goal? Well, let me tell you. Having a goal for your podcast is as important as getting in your car and knowing exactly where you're going, but also which roads you need to take in order to get there. So think about like as a GPS, right? Guiding you on your journey, and you're still in the driver's seat. So it's up to you to make decisions about where to go, which roads to take if you do want to take different roads. But you have that one place in mind, like you know where your destination is, you have that GPS guiding you. And so it just makes everything easier. You don't have to freak out if anything kind of like unexpected happens. If you have to pick up a passenger, you can set up a new destination. It's just one of those things that I truly believe will help you achieve success. Because let's be honest, when you think about what your goal with your podcast is, it's probably something that either you set up a long time ago or you never thought about it. You just wanted to get it going. You just had like, okay, I know that people have been telling me to podcast, or I know I want to do this, but you really never took the time to think about what does success look like, right? And knowing what success looks like, it's potentially one of the most important things on your podcast because it's going to be a longer journey than most, right? You know that podcasting's benefits really come through in the long term. And so let's make sure that you know exactly what your motivation is going to be, what success looks like in order to succeed, right? Okay, so let's kind of go through a few of them. And one thing that I wanted to keep in mind is that obviously these could be changing, right? Like you don't have to set up one and that's the one that you will always keep and never change. You can also combine a few of these and do different episodes to do different things. That's the cool thing about podcasting is that you don't have to just keep a very strong structure. You kind of can pick and choose and combine. Like this podcast, for example, for me is creating some goals in the immediate term, in the medium and long-term goals. And they're actually different. My goals for the now are very different than the ones long-term. Like, for instance, this show is on video because it is my goal to, one, create visual content that is exciting, right? Like you can follow along, see our expressions. I also plan at some point, not just yet, this is the kind of like still the beginning, but I want to make sure that we're doing a lot of like creative and visual things. I want to talk about like setting up a background like mine, things like, kind of like really need to be done visually. But also for me, one of the things that I wanted to do was to create long form content to drive more traffic to my website. And so YouTube is a great way to do that. Also, I thought it would be a really good challenge to do that. So again, I'm getting ahead of myself here. But I thought that I kind of like always like to give you concrete examples of how I'm using this show because I think that is way more powerful when I do that like that. All right, so I have to pace myself here. So, different ways to use your podcast. You can use your podcast, and I'm going to kind of list them all, and then we're going to go delve into each one of them, and I'm going to give you examples. So, the first one, this is the most common one, is to use it as content. The second is networking with decision makers, thought leadership, driving sales in your business, lead generation for your business, a creative outlet, and career switching. So let's go into each one of them. All right. So first things first, podcast content. Like for instance, I never really liked writing initially. I really don't. I picked obviously radio as a medium because I really love talking, and honestly, my brain goes 1,000 miles per minute, and so I thought it would be, the perfect vehicle to share my point of view. So you can do it if you have a business, primarily to create content that goes into your newsletters, into your blog, into like articles. And by the way, you don't have to call the stuff that you write on your website blogs. It can be articles. It can be called resources. I call mine articles because I think that the thought leadership there and the solid advice there does qualify them to be articles and not so much blogs. So that's what I call them. One of our clients, she's like me. We're like together. We're like, we don't like writing. It's kind of like you feel really stuck, or like then the words just don't flow naturally. So creating a podcast can really feed your online kind of ecosystem. And by the way, I actually created a whole course on this. It's called Maximize Your Podcast Content, because through working with a ton of entrepreneurs, I realized so many people get really overwhelmed, and this may be your case as well, where you're supposed to, write newsletters and write social media posts and write articles, and like, how do you all connect in order to avoid overwhelm? I created that podcast course. You can actually check the description of this video or this podcast, and then obviously thepodcastbase.com/course. So with that side, it does not need to be overwhelming. There's tons of ways to do that. But so if you hate writing, hate is a very strong word. But if you feel like you would be compelled to create more content if you were to do that in audio or video form, that's great. Because there's this expression that is out of sight, out of mind. And so if you want to do business with people, if you want to let them know what's going on, you have to be present. You have to show up. Whether it's by creating blog posts or video format or audio, it doesn't matter, but you have to be present online. In today's time, if you're not having a website, if you're not having social media, it's like you don't exist, right? So just let me remind you that it just is a necessity. So going into like the second one, so networking. I cannot tell you how excited I am to welcome so many amazing guests on my show. And so what I'm doing this show for in the immediate term is really to broaden my network, but also to improve the quality of my network. I'm going to be aiming at welcoming really big players in the podcast industry. Now, could I have them just for a cup of coffee on a Zoom? Probably not. Maybe most people in the podcast industry, they're really nice. But for you, maybe your industry is more open. Maybe it's just very close. Podcasts are still considered kind of like quote unquote, like high value tasks, like media wise. So it's great exposure for brands, for thought leaders in big companies to be on podcasts because it's like free advertisement. And so they are willing to be on your show because they see it as one, traffic that goes back to the website. Obviously, if you put your content online, it will drive interest to their business. But also for you, I mean, you are able to ask people that normally you wouldn't because you are the host of a show. So make sure that you invite people who are, kind of like within your reach, like people that you want to highlight. They're amazing, but honestly, make sure that you are inviting people who are just not in your current circle and you are improving the level of your network. Just one more thing that I want to add to that is that the quality of the people that you bring on the show, like if they're really giving value to your audience, if they are big thought leaders, you will by default, by proxy, be considered someone who is knowledgeable and who is of value. So if anything, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and invite people who are like you're punching above your waistline. I think that's the expression. So that you're really being perceived as a thought leader up to the level because they said yes to being on your show. All right. So I want to make sure that when you are thinking about your guests, you're thinking about also the perception of value that people will have of you. Because if you're just having people who are not known in the industry, it's not going to have as much of a stronger impact if you're inviting people who are very visible and who are out and about and who are doing things. Okay. So the next one is something that I want you to really be mindful of, and that is thought leadership. How am I using this podcast to showcase my thought leadership? Well, before I was using mainly Instagram and social media to create bite-sized information for people or to create articles. And now what I'm doing is I'm showcasing my thought leadership through my voice, through video and voice, and through a form of content that you can consume when you're driving, right? So I am making an effort to tell you about podcasting, maybe when you're driving, maybe when you are out and about and not really being able to look at a screen. I'm making sure that you have access to my expertise in longer form, right? Instead of being just a 60-second video, I'm able to do that in a longer format. So again, if you can't talk about something for more than 60 seconds, do you really know your topic, right? So hopefully by doing this kind of content, I'm bringing in more people. And that leads kind of into my next point, lead generation. We all know that obviously through social media, you have to do online content to grow your brand, right? And so doing a podcast also does lead generation, which is warms people to do business with you when either you're ready to launch a product or they are ready to buy your product. Because remember, people will buy from you when they need it, right? Like they may love you, but like still, people don't just give away their money. And they're way more likely to buy products and services from you once they've been doing that after listening to your show for a while. For instance, I myself have bought books from podcasters who I binged through their show in like a month. I bought their book, I bought like their ebooks, and then other people who had like products that were a bit more expensive. So I needed to have that need to buy that product. And so when it was time to make that decision, I was like, yeah, I've been with this person for, I've been quote unquote with this person for 2 years. I've been following what they're doing. And now I'm ready to buy because I have that specific need. And I know they've been with me, giving me really good advice and really showcasing a lot of stuff that has improved my life. And so by the time I was ready, I bought. So if you're thinking about launching a product or service, or if you have one, that's a great word. But the one thing that I would caution you is that unless you have a brand that really connects with people, not everyone will buy immediately from you. They will need some time to kind of like digest what you're saying and figure out like, okay, is this what I need? Yes. So I want to do a little side note, and that is that if you're trying to be a public speaker, a podcast is great to do that because you're improving your skills, right? You're improving the time that you're speaking to the camera, especially if you're trying to do maybe like live streaming or try to do it as off the cuff as possible and practicing maybe your topics or something like that. That is a great way to use your podcast. I know for a fact that doing a lot of shows live, doing live events, doing master classes has helped me to become a more confident speaker. It may not seem because I mess up on these podcasts, but it definitely takes the nerves away. I mean, I will say you will always get a little nervous when you're doing a live show, when you're doing kind of like preparing for an interview. That will always happen. I mean, when I was doing live radio, it always happened. I was always a little bit nervous. But then once I kind of like got going, it was just done. And I was like, okay, I'm doing it. That's fine. Okay, for sales, that kind of is tied in with lead generation. But obviously, if you have products and services, mentioning them on your podcast, and by the way, I'm going to say that again, mentioning them on your podcast, that is the important part. I cannot tell you how many podcasters I've worked with. They book consulting time. They're like, Anna, I'm not selling. I don't understand. People told me, or you told me that I could be selling products and services on my podcast or improve the sales of my products and services. And I don't see anything. And I was like, all right, let's do a podcast audit. And I realized that they never mentioned their products, maybe once in a blue moon on social media posts. And on the podcast, it was just like, hey, if you'd like to learn more about, these person's products and services, it was on the outro, actually. It wasn't even said by the person. They would say something like, yeah, like check the website, but it didn't really explain the benefit. It didn't explain the content, wasn't really connected to what the person was selling. So it was obviously hard for the listener to feel like that product is the right for them. So I've done that earlier on this show where I told you, hey, if you feel overwhelmed by this, actually you can take my course to do it. I'm still learning how to do it live, so obviously it's not the best way to kind of showcase how to do it effortlessly, but it's just an exercise. It's awkward for me to tell you and try to like weave in like my products and services, but I'm doing it because eventually I'll get better. And hopefully you're like, oh, tell me more about the course. I didn't know. And I was like, phew, okay, it's working. All right. So the one thing that I want to tell you is if your day job isn't giving you what you need in terms of passion for an industry or something, you can always do a podcast to do that, right? So I work with a few people actually who use their podcast as a hobby, and they used it to connect to people in an industry that they hadn't access to. It was something really exciting. I can't really talk much because I didn't ask permission for the client to talk about it, so I'm not going to. But I remember vividly, remember listening to these podcasts and thinking, wow, this person really shines. They're so excited to be interviewing other people in this industry that they're not a part of. And that's the thing, they love their day job. They didn't want to change it. And so they were like, you know what? I don't want to change, because you don't always have to actually do what you love. If that's providing for you, if that's enabling you to do all these other amazing things, your podcast can be the creative outlet, right? Some people knit. You can use your podcast as a creative outlet. Finally, let's look into transitioning careers. This is potentially one of the things that I think we're going to see more and more of. They weren't really popular maybe 3-4 years ago, but I see them more and more. People that don't have the confidence to just go into a whole new industry. They're trying to kind of feel the field and figuring out if that's something that they want to do. Maybe they want to change geographically where they are working in. And so they are using the podcast to really build that network and learning about that industry. So as you see, they're combining multiple purposes for the podcast to get what they need. And so that's the thing. If your podcast is done to reach more people, well, that's your goal. That's one strategy. And I think that needs to be a separate podcast episode because I'm going way too long. And I want these to be super actionable for you, because I want you to listen to every episode and feel okay, I remember pretty much, 70% of what was said on this show, instead of going and taking you on a 40-minute drive. And then you're I remember 20%, right? So I want you to finish this episode. And if it sounds like you're going to be shifting your goal, if you're going to kind of go somewhere else, or if you're really honing into what I just talked about, let me know. You can always drop me a message at hello@thepodcastspace.com, or my preferred social media network, which is Instagram. I'm at The Podcast Space. And so if you haven't, please go onto our website and subscribe to the newsletter so you can receive these podcast episodes directly on your inbox, or at least links to it. And I always share personal little bits of information, and this podcast is giving me so much to talk about, because every single time I'm releasing a new episode, I'm seeing this from my lens instead of me coaching clients. And it's just been fascinating. And so I always share kind of little tidbits of information. So for more resources, check out thepodcastspace.com/resources, and anything that you heard on these podcasts will be in the description below. And so remember, keep sharing these podcasts with friends and family. I really appreciate it. Word of mouth is huge for podcast growth. And so if you can, share it with a podcaster friend, and I'll see you next week. Just keep releasing imperfect content that drives you forward. All right, bye.